My family loved me most when I stayed silent, useful, and small. The moment I stopped shrinking, they called me selfish, and that's when everything changed. I learned how to disappear before I learned how to speak up. In my family, love wasn't something you received, it was something you earned, and the currency was sacrifice. Your time, your wants, your voice. The more of yourself you gave up, the more they smiled at you, the more they praised you, the more they said things like, "She's such a good girl and she never asks for much." I was proud of that once. I was 6 years old the first time I realized being good meant being quiet. We were in the living room, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and something fried too long. My cousins were running around, screaming, knocking into furniture. I sat on the floor with my legs crossed, coloring carefully inside the lines. My aunt looked down at me and smiled. "Why can't the others be like you?" she said. "So calm, so mature." My chest warmed at that. Approval felt like sunlight. I leaned into it without knowing the cost. When my cousin knocked over a lamp and got yelled at, I stayed still. When my brother complained he was bored, I kept coloring. I learned early that attention came in two forms, negative and conditional, and I chose the one that hurt less. No one asked what I wanted to draw. By the time I was 10, I knew the rules. If my mother was tired, I didn't ask questions. If my father was stressed, I stayed out of his way. If someone needed help, I offered it before they asked. "Look at her," they'd say, "always thinking of others." What they didn't say was that I learned to think of myself last. I remember one night, late, quiet, the house holding its breath, when I stood in the doorway of my parents' room. I had a school form in my hand, a field trip, science museum, something small, something normal. My mother was folding laundry, her back to me. "Mom," I said softly. She didn't turn around. "What?" "I need you to sign this. It's for school." She sighed, not angry, just tired. That was worse. "Can it wait?" she asked. I nodded immediately, too fast. "Of course." I backed out of the room like I'd done something wrong. I never brought it up again. The permission slip stayed unsigned. The trip came and went. When my teacher asked why I didn't go, I said I didn't want to. That was my first lie for the sake of peace. It wouldn't be my last. As I grew older, my role solidified. I was the listener, the helper, the one who didn't cause problems. When relatives argued, I smoothed things over. When someone was sick, I showed up. When plans fell apart, I adjusted mine without complaint. They praised me for being low maintenance. They didn't notice I was starving. Every time I tried to express something real, excitement, anger, ambition, it was met with confusion or dismissal. "Don't be dramatic. You're overthinking it. Why do you always make things so deep?" Eventually, I stopped trying. Dreams became private things, fragile things. I folded them up and tucked them away where no one could touch them or mock them. I told myself this was love, that this was family, that someday it would balance out, that someday they'd see me. The praise continued, but only when I erased myself, when I gave up weekends to help, when I postponed plans to be available, when I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. "She never complains," my mother would say proudly. I learned to smile through the ache in my chest, learned to nod when people talked over me, learned to swallow words before they reached my tongue. And the more I shrank, the more comfortable they became. That should have scared me. Instead, I worked harder. Because when you're raised on conditional love, you don't recognize freedom, you recognize approval. And I was addicted to it. I didn't know yet that one day choosing myself would cost me everything they'd ever given me. I didn't know that the moment I stopped shrinking would be the moment they turned on me. I only knew that somewhere deep inside, something small and stubborn was still breathing. I didn't notice when giving became my full-time job. It crept in slowly, disguised as responsibility, as loyalty, as being the dependable one. Somewhere between my late teens and early 20s, my life stopped feeling like it belonged to me and started feeling like something the family passed around when they needed it. And they always needed it. It started with little things, a ride here, an errand there. "You're already out, right? You don't mind, do you?" I learned to say no problem even when my chest tightened and my plans dissolved. I learned how to reroute my days on a dime, how to apologize for hesitating, how to offer explanations no one asked for. Because silence, real silence, made them uncomfortable, and disappointment made me panic. So I kept giving. Time, energy, emotional labor, money when I had it, comfort when I didn't. I was the one they called when something broke, when someone cried, when they needed someone to listen without judgment. I was the soft place to land, the spare tire, the emotional junk drawer. They said things like, "You're just better at this stuff," and "You're so mature," and "We don't know what we'd do without you." I let those words replace everything they never said. By my mid-20s, I had built an entire identity around being useful. At family gatherings, I floated between rooms like background music, present, unobtrusive, filling the silence. I refilled drinks without being asked, cleaned up without comment, remembered birthdays no one else did. I was praised for anticipating needs before they were spoken. "She just knows," my aunt would say, smiling like it was a compliment. What she meant was, "You've trained yourself not to need anything." I didn't even realize how deep it went until I tried once to ask for help. It was small, embarrassingly small. I was overwhelmed at work, stretched thin, running on fumes. I mentioned, casually, carefully, that I might need a weekend to myself. The room went quiet. My mother tilted her head, studying me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "A weekend?" she said. "From what?" The way she asked it, half amused, half irritated, made heat crawl up my neck. "I've just been tired," I said. "I've been helping a lot lately." There it was, the shift, subtle but sharp. "Well, everyone's tired," she said slowly. My brother laughed. "Must be nice to complain about being busy." I smiled, because that's what I did. I smiled and nodded and swallowed the feeling that something sacred had just been dismissed. I didn't bring it up again. The thing about conditional love is that it teaches you to ignore patterns until they're undeniable. But once you see them, you can't unsee them. I started noticing how my presence was assumed, not appreciated. How my absence, real or imagined, was treated like betrayal. If I couldn't make it to a gathering, the guilt came fast and thick. "Wow, guess you're too busy for us now. You've changed. Must be nice to think you're above family." No one asked why. They only asked, "How dare you?" And the praise? It turned sharper, more performative. "She does so much for everyone," my mother would say in front of others, her tone proud, but her eyes cool, like she was reminding me who I was supposed to be. I was starting to realize something ugly. They didn't love me despite my sacrifices. They loved me because of them. And the moment I stopped paying that price, I felt the balance shift. The first time I tried to set a boundary, it felt like stepping off a cliff. It was a holiday weekend. Plans had already been made, without asking me, that I would help host, clean, cook, coordinate, all of it. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the text thread lighting up my phone, my chest tight, my hands shaking just a little. "Can you get there early? We're counting on you. Don't forget the dessert." Something inside me pushed back. "I can't do this time," I typed, then erased, typed again. "I won't be able to help this weekend. I need a break." I stared at the message for a full minute before hitting send. The response came almost immediately. "What do you mean? This is important. We already planned around you." Planned around me, like I was furniture. I tried to explain that I was tired, that I needed rest, that I wasn't saying no forever. The explanation didn't matter. The tone changed, cold, tight. "Well, do what you want," my mother wrote. "I guess we'll figure it out." That sentence, "do what you want," landed like an accusation. I didn't go. And for the first time in my life, the silence afterwards wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. No calls, no check-ins, no "are you okay?" Just absence. It hurt more than I expected. When we finally spoke again later, it was like nothing had happened. That was another pattern. They didn't resolve conflict. They buried it, let it rot quietly until it turned into resentment. My aunt made a joke about me finally discovering self-care. My brother rolled his eyes when I talked. My mother watched me carefully like she was measuring something. I felt like I'd crossed an invisible line, and that's when the word appeared. Selfish. It slipped into conversations like it had always belonged there. "She's just thinking about herself these days." People change when they get independent. You have to be careful not to forget where you came from. No one said it to my face at first. They said it around me. Let it echo. Let it settle. I started questioning myself again. Am I selfish? Did I take too much? Did I misunderstand what family means? The old reflex kicked in, to apologize, to overcorrect, to give more. But something inside me hesitated. because for the first time, the math didn't add up. I wasn't taking anything. I was just not giving everything. The more I pulled back, even slightly, the colder some of them became. Others stayed quiet, neutral, passive. That silence hurt almost as much as the criticism. No one defended me. No one said, "She deserves rest." No one asked how I was doing. They watched. And in their watching, I felt something settle in my bones, a realization I'd been avoiding for years. My worth to them had limits, and those limits were defined by how much I was willing to disappear. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that finally cracked something open. We were sitting together after dinner, plates half cleared, the room dim, heavy with that post-meal quiet. My mother looked at me and said, "You used to be easier." I waited for the rest, for the concern, for the softness. It didn't come. "I don't know what happened to you," she continued. "You used to understand how families work." I looked at her, really looked, at the familiarity in her face, at the expectation, at the unspoken demand that I return to the version of myself that made her comfortable. And for the first time, I didn't rush to fix it. "I still understand," I said quietly. "I just don't agree anymore." Her eyes hardened. "That's a shame, because this," she gestured vaguely, "this is starting to look selfish." The word hung there between us, heavy, final. Something inside me shifted, not snapped, not exploded, but moved, like a door closing softly, on purpose. I realized then that no amount of explaining would change their story, because their story needed me small, and I was done pretending that was love. The moment didn't arrive with fireworks or screaming. It came the way everything in my family did, wrapped in obligation, disguised as necessity, and delivered like I didn't have a choice. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because the light was wrong, too bright, slanted through the window like it was trying to expose something I'd been avoiding. I almost didn't answer. My body knew before my brain caught up, that tightness in my chest, the quiet dread that had become muscle memory. "Hey," she said. Her voice was neutral, careful, that tone she used when she was about to ask for something she'd already decided I owed her. "We need to talk." I closed my eyes. "Okay." There was a pause. I could hear the TV in the background, some game show, laughter that didn't belong to either of us. "We're having a family meeting this weekend," she said. "It's important." Important. That word always meant come prepared to give something up. "What about?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Your aunt's situation," she said. "Things have gotten complicated, and, well, we're going to need you." There it was. Not, "Can you help?" Not, "Are you available?" Just need, like my life was a resource they could tap without warning. I asked what that meant. She gave me pieces, vague outlines, a crisis that had been brewing quietly, money issues, caretaking expectations, responsibilities being passed down like a debt. "And we think," she added, her voice softening just enough to sound reasonable, "that it makes the most sense if you step in." Step in, again. I leaned back against the wall, the phone pressed to my ear, the weight of every past yes stacking up inside me. "I can't," I said. The word felt foreign, sharp, real. She didn't respond right away. "You can't?" she repeated, like she was testing the sound of it. "I won't," I corrected gently. "I can't take this on. I'm not in a place to do that." The silence on the other end wasn't empty. It was calculating. "Well," she said finally, "we'll talk about it on Saturday." That wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The house was already full when I arrived. Too full, too loud, the air thick with perfume, old furniture, and unspoken expectations. Everyone was there. My aunt, my uncle, my brother, cousins who rarely showed up unless something was being divided or decided. I noticed immediately where I was placed, the edge of the room, a chair pulled in last minute, like an afterthought. The conversation started without me. They talked logistics, money, time, who couldn't help and why. Excuses flowed freely for everyone else. Jobs, kids, stress, distance. When it came to me, the room shifted. My aunt turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "you don't have as many commitments." I felt something tighten in my chest. My brother nodded. "You're good at handling stuff like this." My mother watched me, waiting. I looked around the room, at the people who had praised my sacrifice my entire life, who had benefited from my silence, who had never once asked what it cost me. "I'm not doing it," I said. The room went quiet. Not shocked quiet, offended quiet. My uncle cleared his throat. That's a little selfish, don't you think? There it was, out loud this time. No whispers, no side comments. Selfish. I felt my face flush, but my voice stayed steady. I've done this my whole life. I'm not able to do anymore. My aunt's smile disappeared. So everyone else is supposed to suffer because you suddenly decided to focus on yourself? Suddenly, like this hadn't been decades in the making. I'm not asking anyone to suffer. I'm asking not to be volunteered. My mother finally spoke. This family has always been there for you. The words landed wrong, heavy, untrue. When? I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. That's not fair, she snapped. You've always had support. I thought of the nights I cried alone, the dreams I folded up and put away, the times I needed help and learned not to ask. I had expectations. That's not the same thing. The room erupted then, voices overlapping, accusations, disbelief. After everything we've done, you're breaking the family apart. You think you're better than us now. And underneath it all, the same message I'd heard my entire life. Get back in your place. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I realized in that moment that this was never going to change. Not if I stayed, not if I explained better, not if I sacrificed harder. They didn't want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a function. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I stood anyway. I love you, I said, and meant it in the saddest way possible. But I'm done paying for that love with my life. No one stopped me when I walked out. That hurt more than if they had. The fallout was immediate. Texts poured in, calls I didn't answer, messages that swung wildly between guilt and anger. How could you do this to your mother? We raised you better than this. You've changed, and not for the better. I read them all. I didn't respond. For the first time, I let the silence exist without rushing to fill it. And in that silence, grief came crashing in. Not just grief for the family I was losing, but for the version of me that had believed love meant endurance, that suffering quietly was noble, that being needed was the same as being cherished. I cried in my car, in the shower, on the floor of my apartment with my back against the door, like I was bracing for something to break in. But underneath the pain, something else was there. Relief. No more pretending, no more shrinking, no more waiting for permission to exist. They tried to pull me back in, of course. A few weeks later, my mother called again. Her voice was softer this time, wounded. We don't recognize you anymore, she said. I almost laughed. Almost. I'm starting to recognize myself, I replied. She didn't have an answer for that. Walking away didn't make me strong overnight. It made me lonely. It made me question myself. It made me ache for a family that never really existed the way I needed it to. But it also made something else possible. Space. And in that space, I started to rebuild, not out of defiance, not out of revenge, but out of truth. I stopped apologizing for resting, stopped explaining my boundaries, stopped offering pieces of myself to people who only knew how to take. I didn't know yet how the story would end. I only knew that the girl who learned to shrink was gone, and she wasn't coming back. And underneath it all, the same message I'd heard my entire life. Get back in your place. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I realized in that moment that this was never going to change. Not if I stayed, not if I explained better, not if I sacrificed harder. They didn't want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a function. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I stood anyway. I love you, I said, and meant it in the saddest way possible. But I'm done paying for that love with my life. No one stopped me when I walked out. That hurt more than if they had. The fallout was immediate. Texts poured in, calls I didn't answer, messages that swung wildly between guilt and anger. How could you do this to your mother? We raised you better than this. You've changed, and not for the better. I read them all. I didn't respond. For the first time, I let the silence exist without rushing to fill it. And in that silence, grief came crashing in. Not just grief for the family I was losing, but for the version of me that had believed love meant endurance, that suffering quietly was noble, that being needed was the same as being cherished. I cried in my car, in the shower, on the floor of my apartment with my back against the door like I was bracing for something to break in. But underneath the pain, something else was there. Relief. No more pretending, no more shrinking, no more waiting for permission to exist. They tried to pull me back in, of course. A few weeks later, my mother called again. Her voice was softer this time, wounded. "We don't recognize you anymore," she said. I almost laughed. Almost. "I'm starting to recognize myself," I replied. She didn't have an answer for that. Walking away didn't make me strong overnight. It made me lonely. It made me question myself. It made me ache for a family that never really existed the way I needed it to. But it also made something else possible: space. And in that space, I started to rebuild, not out of defiance, not out of revenge, but out of truth. I stopped apologizing for resting, stopped explaining my boundaries, stopped offering pieces of myself to people who only knew how to take. I didn't know yet how the story would end. I only knew that the girl who learned to shrink was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The strangest thing about leaving was how quiet my life became. At first, the silence terrified me. No constant calls, no emotional emergencies, no background noise of obligation humming under everything I did. I kept waiting for the guilt to swallow me whole, for the certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. But it didn't. Instead, the quiet settled around me like a clean room. Empty, yes, but full of possibility. I started noticing things I'd never had time for before. How my mornings felt when they weren't rushed. How my shoulders slowly dropped when my phone didn't light up with demands. How my thoughts stretched out, uninterrupted, like they were finally allowed to finish a sentence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being useful. I was just being. I didn't announce my distance from my family. I didn't make a speech or draw lines in the sand. I simply stopped volunteering myself for pain. I said no without explanations. I ignored messages designed to provoke guilt. I let missed calls go to voicemail and stayed present in my own life instead. And slowly, something powerful happened. I got better. Not healed. Healing is messier than that, but stronger, clearer, less afraid of being misunderstood. I invested in myself the way I'd invested in everyone else. I poured energy into my work, my friendships, my body, my mind. I built routines that supported me instead of draining me. I learned what it felt like to rest without earning it first. It wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. Months passed, then years, and the absence they once punished me for started to affect them. Things fell apart without me quietly holding them together. Events became chaotic. Conflicts escalated. Problems they used to hand off landed back in their own laps. That's when the messages changed. They weren't angry anymore. They were uneasy. "You don't visit much. We miss how close we used to be. Families forgive." Forgive. As if I'd done something wrong. I didn't respond. Because the truth was simple. Even if it was uncomfortable, I wasn't punishing them. I just wasn't rescuing them anymore. The moment that closed the door for good came unexpectedly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, asking if I'd be at a family event, some anniversary, some gathering meant to present unity. "I heard you've been doing really well," she added. I smiled at that, not bitterly, just knowingly. "No, I won't be there." She hesitated before typing back, "Your mom's been having a hard time." I took a deep breath. "I know," I wrote. "So have I." That was the last message I sent to anyone in my family. The revenge, if you can call it that, wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it wasn't cruel, it was irreversible. I became someone they no longer had access to. I stopped being the daughter who absorbed everything, stopped being the sister who fixed things, stopped being the woman who shrank so others could feel tall. And that absence, that loss of control, was something they never learned how to handle. They'd built their version of family on my silence. Without it, the cracks showed. Years later, I ran into my mother by accident. A grocery store aisle, fluorescent lights, ordinary as hell. She looked older, tired in a way that went beyond age. When she saw me, her face did that thing, softened and tightened at the same time. "You look good," she said. "I am," I replied. She nodded slowly, like she was taking inventory, like she was realizing something she'd refused to see for a long time. "I didn't realize," she said, almost to herself, "how much you carried." I waited. She didn't apologize. That told me everything. "I hope you're well," I said gently, and I meant it, in the way you wish peace for people you no longer let close enough to hurt you. I walked away before she could say anything else. My hands weren't shaking. I used to think bravery meant endurance, staying, surviving. Now I know better. Bravery is choosing yourself when it costs you everything familiar. It's letting people misunderstand you rather than betray yourself again. It's walking away without needing them to agree. They called me selfish when I stopped shrinking. What they never understood was this: I didn't become selfish, I became whole. And that was something they could never take from me, no matter how hard they tried.